Serious, lawyers, what's a case you regretted winning? I'm a work comp attorney, now represent injured people, but used to work on other side insurance defense. There was an applicant with a serious injury, fell off a ladder, busted back with fusion, shoulder fricked, years of treatment, internal issues, psych issues, really just fricked up. 50% plus permanent disability. We were 5 years in and finally getting to settlement time. If we bought out his future medical settlement pretty far into 6 figures. This guy was the sole provider for wife and 2 kids. Then we found out he had a aggressive brain cancer. Expected only couple years to live, at best. Thus, we wouldn't buy out future medical anymore. Still got permanent disability for $60 cash. But can't give medical buyout based on 25 plus year life expectancy anymore. I felt terrible for the guy and his family. Me and the adjuster tried to get insurance to agree to some sort of amount like 5-year buyout, but the bean counters said heck no. The attorney knew it wasn't me making the decision. Even though he worked on that guy's file for 5 plus years, he decided to take $0 in fees. I have so much respect for that attorney turning down $10k plus in fees to help his client in a very crappy situation. Working in insurance defense feels like selling your soul at times. I do family law and I represented a father who had lost most of his custody from HDUs and imprisonment as a result. He came to me saying he was clean and doing good and had his life together and it checked out. He had been clean for almost 9 months not counting jail time and seemed sincere in wanting to resume a full relationship with his son. The other side fought viciously to keep him at extremely little custody and supervised at that, but we prevailed and got an order restoring fairly frequent unsupervised partial custody. Not long afterwards, only about 3 months after the case, he was back doing sold most of his furniture, and for me the most soul crushing is that he set up a fake GoFundMe stuff for his child's cancer. His child didn't have cancer and has never had cancer, so you know where that money was going. I withdrew my appearance at this point, so I don't know what happened afterwards, but I imagine and hope his custody was taken away. Basically the net result of winning that case was that the poor boy had to witness his father relapse on H and was exploited for money. Worst case I ever won. As a mom with a child's father like this, if this were to ever happen, I wouldn't blame you. Eviction law. Basically every other case, even the buttholes. It's not rewarding to put people out on the curb, ever. I work in medical malpractice defense. Once I had an obstetrician gynecologist who burned a patient during a procedure. When I met with the doctor, he lied to me throughout the representation over 16 months, saying he had no idea how it happened. There is a doctrine in law called res ipsa, meaning absent some sort of negligence, this accident could not have occurred. Woman came in without a burn, and after the procedure, the woman left with a burn. There's no way this doctor didn't know what had happened. The area of the burn was where he was operating on. It wasn't until I brought up settlement, because this was not a case we could win, did he say, oh maybe I do know what happened. We ultimately settled that case, which is considered a favorable outcome considering the potential high monetary verdict. Sometimes I think this doctor really ought to have lost that case and their license. Settled a personal injury case for a guy and he was set to get about $5,000. He was in jail. I held the money for a couple months and when he got out he came by to get the money without delay. The next day the cops came around and asked if I knew him. I explained that I did. I was told he died that night of an overdose and the only thing found on him was my card, some drugs he had not yet used, and a needle. Guy lost his wife and children in a car accident. He wanted to exercise to get his emotions and mental health back in check. Doctor wrote him recommendations for exercise equipment. Ball, chin-up bar, nothing crazy, and he submitted the expenses for same to his insurer. Client, insurer adjuster, wanted this for tooth and nail because exercise equipment was only covered for physical rehab and he was not physically injured. I do not practice in this area anymore. I wouldn't say I regret this so much as to this day it amazes me. As a first-year associate I was given a terrible pie case where my client received a flu shot and thereafter felt pain in his shoulder. He went to another doctor who performed an MRI and determined he had a torn rotator cuff, which was undoubtedly not related. My job was to allege the flu shot caused the rotator cuff tear. Our ortho actually correlated the two. which is the more regrettable position, and the case paid out. Being the bottom of the totem pole, I had no choice but to take the case, which was handed down by a partner. But at the same time, just overwhelmingly made me feel like the worst stereotyped attorney and just hated having to walk into court on it and feel my reputation being destroyed. I do juvenile work, criminal law and family law. I represented this client first when he was a juvenile charged with disorderly conduct at school and fighting. Then when he became an adult, it was for simple things like possession of marijuana. As he got older, it became easier and easier to figure out what part of his life hasn't gone as well as it could, and I tried to counsel him and push him to better himself. He got his GED, he started going to NA, he started classes at a community college, and found a part-time job. On the night of his 21st birthday, he was charged with a DWI. Of course I'll take care of that too. About 6 months later, we are due in court for trial on a Monday, and he doesn't show up, which at this point in his life is highly unusual. As I'm trying to figure out where he is, the court starts going over arraignment's first appearances, and then lo and behold, 3 people are up for murder charges. The prosecution starts to tell the judge what the fact circumstances of the case are and mentions a few victims' names. Apparently, my client was at a party when these 3 individuals decided to allegedly do a drive-by shooting. My client suffered multiple gunshot wounds and didn't make it to the hospital. So, by default, as you can't prosecute a dead person, the state has to take a dismissal. I guess technically a win. Either way, it was crushing to me as I thought he had really turned his life around. He had. I'm so sorry to hear that. This is the first comment on this post that really tugged at my heart. As a personal injury attorney, I've seen a few clients win the blue collar lotto or getting more money than they reasonably know how to deal with. I do my best to educate them, but my job is to try and maximize their recovery, not teach them finance. I have definitely contributed to a few drug habits. In one of my first cases after passing the bar exam, a young man retained me on a drunk driving charge. No one was hurt, but he totaled his car. During trial, the arresting police officer testified that my client was clearly drunk at the accident scene, and that my client was loudly blaming the accident on the freaking butthole who stole his car, crashed it, and then fled before the cops arrived. However, according to 2 other witness statements tendered into evidence, it was my client's friend, the passenger, who was screaming about the butthole who stole the car, not my client, the driver. The cop must have confused the 2 men during his testimony. This discrepancy raised a reasonable doubt in the judge's mind, so she acquitted my client. At the time, the acquittal was somewhat unexpected for me. In my personal view, my client was clearly drunk and responsible for the accident, regardless of who was blaming the mystery butthole to the cops, but I was happy my young client got off. No one was hurt, and lessons were learned, and I was quite euphoric to have won my first criminal case. The regret? About a month after the acquittal, my young client called me at 3 AM from the police station saying it's me again. The police arrested me for drunk driving again. Can you help me? Not only did I answer no, I instantly regretted getting the earlier acquittal. My client apparently didn't learn any lessons. That didn't end nearly as badly as I thought it would. I was expecting him to have killed somebody while drunk driving. I got a spoiled brat of a teenager cleared of a shoplifting charge when he absolutely had done it. His rich parents hired me to represent him. I did that to the best of my ability, and we went to trial and won. But I can't say I felt good about it. This kid needed to be taught some accountability for his actions, and his parents just wanted to buy their way out of any trouble he got into. Had this happened to me twice. Got my client out on bail only to they're off to have him up and killed. First time, he was in building supposedly selling, got chased by the police and a struggle ensued where he was shot point blank in the head. Mother told me that it was my fault that he was killed and that I was working with the and the police. Second time, a young man no more than 16 gets released while waiting trial on robbery. One of the conditions of release was that he maintain a curfew. That very night he breaks curfew, goes over to somebody else's house and was killed in a drug-related robbery. Mother blamed me and said that the devil was working through me, that we were all demons. Criminal defense is a hard business. I think the common thread here is more mother than you. It sounds like the kids who never got disciplined because they were made to believe it was always someone else's fault they messed up. Did a divorce where the husband, who I was representing, wanted to trade custody of his children for a set of bedroom furniture. The bedroom furniture was not even like a family heirloom. It was furniture that you could probably get at a Rooms to Go or something. Ugh. Still makes me ill. That's why I got out of family law. Thank goodness he fought for the furniture and not the kids, if that's the kind of dad he would be, choosing objects over his children. I won a summary judgment motion that my firm filed not expecting to win. We had a decent argument, but odds were way worse than a coin flip and judges don't like granting summary judgment because it's an extreme remedy. Client initially was thrilled. Case is over. We tried to break the news gently. Nope. 3 years later we're back in the same spot we were before we won our motion. The other side appealed it up to the state Supreme Court and won, because the Supreme Court said the trial judge should have denied our motion. So, we are back at square one. North of $100k in legal bills, with no resolution. Maybe it'll settle. Maybe it will go to trial. I'll find out in the next 3-4 months. ETA. Clarified my parenthetical. The one I particularly hated happened at my first law job. This woman was a long-term client of my boss. In the past 10 years or so, she has been caught driving under the influence 8 times, violated home incarceration countless times, been caught with controlled substances a few times, and stabbed 2 people on home incarceration. My boss at the time was the master of getting people off for DUIs, so she had only been convicted of a DUI third and always managed to stay on home incarceration with whatever releases she desired. I always regretted her cases because that woman is truly a danger to the public. She's undoubtedly going to kill someone someday, but I'll be damned if she isn't the luckiest woman alive in getting away with DUIs. Little late to the party, but I've got one I still think about a lot. Worked in criminal defense, represented a guy in a DUI. He had priors, so another conviction meant time, loss of license, problems. Long story short, he was pulled over by police after they followed him leaving a bar. At trial I elicited admissions from the arresting officer that during the 2.5 miles he followed him for, he did not observe a single moving violation. No speeding, erratic driving, driving over the lines, blowing stop signs, running red lights, didn't even stop suddenly at red lights. Also got the DRE officer to testify that the accused only spoke Spanish and they couldn't get an interpreter officer to the roadside to explain the field sobriety exercises, which the officers documented the accused refused to perform. Jury came back in 15 minutes. Guy was extremely grateful, and his lovely family was very gracious in thanking me and our office. Feel good about the whole thing. Couple months later I'm in county to meet with a client, and I see him in one of the pods. Find out sometime after the trial he violently sexually assaulted his 8-year-old stepdaughter. Think about that one a lot. Not your fault by any means, and you must not blame yourself. Just because he did something unspeakably evil later doesn't mean he didn't deserve to be acquitted in the first case. You did right by your client, which is the very best that can be expected of you. What he did later is on him and him only. There was a case that I saw that involved a claim with fee shifting, meaning that if the plaintiff won, their attorney's fees would get paid by the defendant. Defendant pushed an aggressive legal position at trial that the judge agreed with, and won, avoiding a few thousand in liability to the plaintiff and a few thousand in attorney's fees. So far so good. But then the plaintiff appeals all the way to the state's high court, requiring a ton of briefing and time. High court agrees with plaintiff, reverses and sends back to the trial court, which now enters judgment against the defendant for a few thousand in damages against the plaintiff and tens of thousands of dollars in attorney's fees from the appeal. The defense lawyer probably regretted winning at first on that aggressive argument to the trial court. I convicted the father of murdering his wife and years later found out he lied when he confessed to cover for his teenage son who actually been the one who killed her. In the meanwhile the son committed suicide. Father was content to serve his time in prison. This probably won't be the best answer, but it is a real one. After law school I had to turn down a criminal defense job offer because my wife got a better offer somewhere else. So basically, I followed her along and was desperate to find something. After 3 months of fruitless efforts, I would take just about any job that required a JD, whereas literally the only thing I ever wanted to do was criminal defense. 3 months after moving, I got an interview for a real estate litigation job. They hired me the next day. Looking back, that was probably red flag number 1. First day on the job, they taught me how to foreclose on a claim of lien. These are 2 things I had never heard of before. Turns out, it is totally brainless work if you have the right forms. Mind-numbingly boring, basically just cutting and pasting new addresses and amounts owed. So anyways, it took me about 2 months to realize this. When I had my first set of hearings, but literally my sole purpose at the firm, which represented over 100 homeowners associations, was to take people's houses away from not paying their homeowners association dues. After my first set of foreclosures, I actually slipped into a pretty legitimate depression. I was getting paid peanuts to drive nearly an hour to work every day to do work I despised on behalf of people I literally could not pretend to care about. The straw on the camel's back was when I started signing the foreclosures and realized I was that guy. You know, I understand someone has to do the work, I guess. There certainly is a lot of money to be made, but it was not for me. I did that job for 3 months, came home one Friday, and told my wife I'd rather be homeless than go back on Monday. By some stroke of luck, I started a stellar criminal defense job within 2 weeks, and all of the heartache has 100% been worth it. I've won a lot of cases. You have to redefine winning and losing when doing criminal defense, because sometimes even a particularly juicy plea is a win-imo, and never once felt bad about it. For example, I got a guy's plea deal cut from 60 years to 15 years for a string of robberies where the interrogations and confessions were overwhelmingly unconstitutional. Like, the interrogations were textbook how not to do an interrogation, Missouri v. Seibert, and stuff like that. Never lost sleep over someone not going to jail. So yeah, every case where I took someone's house away, probably 24 times, for not paying her fees, generally $4,000 or less, was the worst case I ever won. Frick hoers. Frick hoers, a blight wherever they go. Not my case, but a former associate of mine won a PPO motion hearing personal protective order, where he represented the person who the order would have been put against, not the victim. The victim's request to put a PPO on his client was denied, and like 2 months later the victim ended up getting put into the hospital by the client. He beat her butt. That one still bothers him. Family law is a little different in that you never really win per se. You may get more favorable rulings or better terms, but unless the opposing party did something illegal or mind-bogglingly stupid, it's never a decisive win really. Although I did have a case where my client fought really hard for the dog, and then ended up turning him over to a shelter. Freaking butthole. The ex-wife received an anonymous tip and was able to get him back quickly. So the fight wasn't even for the dog, it was just to take something she loved away from her. Jesus, divorce really can bring out the absolute worst in people. My client made a lot of promises to his staff and never had planned to keep them. Was sued. 1. I hated every second of the case. Late post, so this will probably get buried. This is another family law story, using a throwaway because some of my colleagues use Reddit. Summer of 2018, I get work regarding what seemed, from the client's description, a pretty drawn out and messy divorce case. The husband was my client, and he made it seem, very adamantly, that his soon-to-be ex-wife was after his every penny. Given he seemed to have a fairly high-paying job, it seemed like a pretty common type of case. The city I work in has many instances of this. It has a high cost of living and a lot of well-paid working professionals in private industry. He was a very well-spoken, amicable guy in his late 50s, and truly seemed like he'd been taken by surprise and betrayed by his soon-to-be ex-wife. When I actually got to the case, however, I was basically floored. His wife was a working professional as well, worked in government. They'd been married for over 20 years and had 2 kids together, and a paid-off house. Before taxes he made almost 3 times what she did, not counting his stock options, and yet she'd contributed equally to their mortgage on every home they'd owned over the course of the marriage. By all accounts, despite a vast difference in income, she'd carried her weight, raised 2 kids, and worked full-time during the entirety of the marriage. I live and work in Canada. She could have easily raked him over the coals in the divorce if it had gone to court. Instead, it seemed like she'd done everything she possibly could to not have him subjected to that. This divorce had been ongoing for 5 years before he hired me, and it was basically him looking a gift horse in the mouth over and over. A constant renegotiation on the contract they'd both signed initially, with him skimping on alimony and then debating on lesser terms. He was basically given an inch and tried to take a mile, dragging it out for so long that the divorce lawyer had to go to court. I almost suspect he did so as a way to try and drag her through the mud, though he may have genuinely been that delusional. I consider it a win only because his ex-wife was adamant about only wanting what was somewhat fair, and for it to be over because of the strain it was having on the family. For the contract he owed her, still, about $50k in back pay, but she was content with $15k, which was less than this guy made in a month. I did regret the win though. She seemed like a very nice woman with the patience of a son, while almost all of his anger towards her seemed to come from wounded ego. I handle employment cases. We took a disability accommodation case against a regional retail company. To be clear, we were right. Our client was not being given a pretty easy accommodation. Normally, demand letters don't have any real effect. We have stopped sending them to streamline the process and have just started filing with the EOC or the courts directly. That's SOP for us. In this case we followed SOP and filed with the EOC. The company got in touch with us immediately, expressing horror and regret. The whole thing was one poorly trained manager acting out. While that's common, companies usually try to cover for the manager and often make things worse. This one did not. They immediately sent him to be retrained, offered the exact accommodation requested, and paid all lost wages and fees, with some extra for emotional distress. Client happily accepted and went back to work. After seeing the company's great response, I felt bad for taking them to the EOC. Not bad enough to start sending time-wasting demand letters again, but if I ever see them on the other side, I'll make an exception. I did some custody work early in my career and won some cases more on the merit of my trial skills than on the merit of the parents. The thing with family law work in general is that there is essentially no bar to entry. Anybody with a law degree and a pulse can get a family law practice up and running quickly because there is just an absolute glut of work. What that also means is that 75% plus of the lawyers practicing family law are clueless and awful. Early in my career I certainly was clueless, but at the least I was not awful. Therefore, in a battle between clueless plus awful versus just clueless, clueless usually won. So yeah, I can't recall any specific cases, except to say that fighting over children in court is a terrible thing and basically everyone loses. I regret that entire portion of my career. Not really winning, but I recently had a case settle where my client was so obviously lying it was painful. He was an offender bender and said he was too disabled to drive or to work at the office as a result, and that his employer fired him after he had been on disability leave for almost a year. A few months after filing, we discovered that he played in a national, amateur, full contact football league and there was footage of him getting tackled, end zone dancing, and tackling during the time he claimed he was too hurt to sit at a desk. Even when I confronted him on it, he claimed he hadn't played while he was injured, despite having a stat line and footage of him playing from games dated on days he was supposedly getting physical therapy. We didn't settle for as much as most of my cases, but he still walked away with like $20k. I'm happy to be a plaintiff's attorney for the most part because my clients have typically been wronged, but he was such a bald-faced liar it really peed me off. I helped a man regain visitation of his child after a year or so in jail. I thought I was a great humanitarian. Oh, the hubris that comes from being a baby attorney. As we were shooting the crap after court waiting for his ride, he showed me his prison tattoo. Giant letters on his torso that spelled war. White Aryan resistance. I'm a blue-eyed blonde, so I guess he thought I was down with the cause. I went home and threw up. Fortunately, that child has 2 parents. Hopefully mom isn't a racist pose. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.